For 30 years, the families at 67 Forest Drive lived on top of a secret they didn't know they shared. 3 different families walked the floors above it. 3 owners ignored it until the seal was finally broken. This is the story with your host, Evelyn Black. And this, my friends, is Hooked on Homicide.
Hello, 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 my fellow morbid darlings, and welcome back to another episode of Hooked on Homicide. If you're new here, I'm Evelyn Black, and this podcast is where you and I will unravel some of the most darkest and sinister cases one stitch at a time. So, with that being said, let's get to it. All right, guys. Today, we are not starting with a crime. In fact, we're going to be starting with a routine moving day that unraveled a 30-year-old nightmare. We're going to be following this case exactly as the investigators did, piece by piece, starting with a 350-pound secret hidden within a crawl space. Now, most people, when they buy a new home, worry about things such as the plumbing, the roof, or maybe a bit of chip paint. But that wasn't the case back in 1999 at 67 Forest Drive in the affluent neighborhood of Jericho, New York, where a new homeowner was worried about a heavy, rusted piece of trash that 3 different families had simply lived with. So I'm going to take you back to the date of September 2nd of 99. It is there that Ronald Cohen is moving out of his home. He just sold his beautiful Long Island home for $455,000. And the buyer of his home had one condition, that the house must be pristine. He wanted every bit of junk out of there, and rightfully so. But now Ronald has a big problem on his hands, because since he moved in back in 1990, there has been a massive 55-gallon steel drum sitting in the dark crawl space under the house. Now, he didn't put it there, and the owner before him, Arthur Eben, didn't put it there either. In fact, Eben had lived with that barrel for 12 years, and he'd even built a house extension right over it. Everyone just assumed it was either some old construction material or a redundant part of the septic system. But today, that barrel, it has to go. So Ronald and a few of his helpers struggle to wrestle the drum out of the crawl space. It's incredibly heavy. They finally get it to the curb for Thursday trash pickup. But when the sanitation workers arrived, they left that barrel behind. And when Ronald went out to the curb to check the next morning, he sees that they attached a note that read, "Too heavy, requires a special appointment." And now Ronald is pissed because they did all that work, and for what, right? He's still stuck with this damn barrel. So he wants his eyesore gone, so he decides to vent the barrel to try and see if he can empty some of the weight. So he goes and grabs a pry bar, and it begins to edge the lid open. And the seal breaks. And then the stench hits him. It's a thick, nauseous, sweet and sour stench of advanced decay. But Ronald didn't let the stench deter him. No, he decides that he's going to look inside. And what he sees isn't construction materials at all. What he sees is a brownish green chemical sludge and 1,000 tiny plastic pellets, the kind you use in shipping. But then, resting on top of that sludge, he sees it. A small, delicate woman's shoe. And near it, a human hand that is mummified and is still wearing a ring around its skeletal finger. Within the hour, 67 Forest Drive is draped in yellow tape. Detectives from the Nassau County Homicide Squad arrive, and they're staring at this rusted time capsule. The drum is carefully transported to the medical examiner's office, and it's there that Dr. Gerard Katsanese is tasked with unboxing the contents. As he removes the plastic pellets and the green sludge, he realizes that the barrel was nearly airtight. And this actually created a rare forensic phenomenon to happen. So, because it was airtight, instead of the body skeletonizing, the lack of oxygen actually caused the remains to mummify, leaving this woman inside perfectly preserved. What the doctor witnessed was that this woman is petite. She was barely 5 feet tall. She has long, dark hair, and she is dressed in 1960s fashion, a floral print skirt, a sweater, and a leopard print coat. But as Dr. Katsanese continues his examination, he makes 2 heart-wrenching discoveries. First, the cause of death. This woman's death was absolutely no accident. He found that she had been struck in the head at least 10 times with a heavy blunt object, and it left her with her skull completely shattered. Second, this is the most heartbreaking part, is that this poor woman, she wasn't alone in that barrel. Inside of her, the doctor finds a 17-inch near-term fetus. This woman was nearly 8 or 9 months pregnant at the time of her death. A mother and her son packaged like industrial waste. It's heartbreaking. So now detectives are working with a ghost, as they have no name, no ID for this woman or her unborn child. But they do have the vessel. Detectives look at the 55-gallon drum. It's a specialized container, and on that container, they find serial numbers stamped into the steel. So they decide to track these numbers, and they find that it's attached to a chemical plant in Linden, New Jersey. The records show that the drum was manufactured in 1965. Next, they analyze the green sludge, and it is identified as halogen green, a very specific dye used for coloring the stems of high-end artificial plants. And the company tells police that they stopped making that specific formula in 1971. So now, with this information, detectives are able to narrow down the timeline between 1965 and 1971. So investigators look into the shipping records. And what they find is that the specific drum of dye was delivered to a company called Melrose Plastics. And when the detectives decided to look up who owned Melrose Plastics in the late 1960s, a name pops up. Howard B. Elkins. Now, here is where the, quote, luck of the investigation actually turns into a chill down the spine. When the detectives look up the property history of 67 Forest Drive, the house where the body was found, they discovered that the man who built that home and the man who lived there from the mid-60s until 1972 was none other than the same man who owned the factory the barrel was shipped to. And that man was Howard Elkins. So while one team of detectives is starting to look at Elkins, another is in the forensics lab. Because inside the barrel, along with the woman and her unborn child, they were able to recover a waterlogged leather pocketbook or purse. And inside of that purse was a tiny address book. And 30 years of being inside of that chemical sludge, it had turned the pages into a black, illegible mess. I mean, I can only imagine. And honestly, most labs would have looked at that and said, "I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do." They would have given up, right? But forensic document examiner Joan Fortner decided to use a technique involving a video spectral comparator. And this uses an infrared light to see through stains. Slowly, and I mean slowly, but surely, names and numbers began to glow on the screen. And what they were able to read were three things. Number one, an alien registration number. Two, the name Marroquin. And three, a phone number for a woman named Kathy. Now, with this information, they struck gold. Because in a 1 in a million stroke of fate, when the detectives dialed that 30-year-old number, Kathy answered. Kathy was still living in the same home, and she still had the same phone number. 30 years later, y'all, she was still in the same place. Like, how? That is just amazing. And when detectives got to speak with her, they asked her if she knew a woman named Marroquin. And when Kathy hears that name, she began to sob. And she stated, and I quote, "I've been waiting for this call for 30 years. Ugh, that is heart-wrenching. So this woman in the barrel, she was no longer a nameless, ID-less, mummified body. Her name was Reyna Angelica Marroquín. And she was a 27-year-old immigrant from El Salvador who traveled to New York in 1966 looking for the American dream. She was a gifted seamstress, and she worked at none other than Melrose Plastics, Howard Elkins' factory. Kathy then tells the detectives the story the police should have heard back in 1969. She states that Reyna had been having an affair with her boss, Howard. He was older, wealthy, and very much married. When Reyna got pregnant, Kathy stated Howard set her up in an apartment in New Jersey, and that he promised he would leave his wife, and he promised that they would eventually be a family. But by January 1969, Howard's lies were falling apart. You see, Reyna knew he was never going to leave his wife, and it left her feeling desperate and alone. That desperation made Reyna make a move that will unfortunately seal her fate. She decided to call Howard's home, and she spoke to his wife Ruth, telling her everything. The last time Kathy spoke to Reyna, she states that Reyna was terrified. She said Howard had found out about the call, that he was coming over, and he was pissed. When Kathy went to check on Reyna the next morning, she states that the apartment was empty, that a meal was still sitting on the stove half-cooked, and Reyna's winter coat was still on the hook. Kathy then explained that she tried to report Reyna missing, and that the 1969 police told her, and I quote, "She's an adult. Maybe she just went back to El Salvador. No body, no crime." End quote. Now armed with a motive and a suspect, they decide to travel to Florida to visit Howard Elkins in person. Howard Elkins is now 70 years old, living a quiet, affluent life in a retirement community in Boca Raton, Florida. And on September 9th of 99, Nassau County detectives knock on his front door. Detectives state that when they approached Elkins, he was very cold. But he did admit that he had an affair with a girl at the factory, but claimed he can't remember her name. How convenient. And when they showed him a photo of the rusted barrel found in his old crawl space, he stares at them blankly, stating, "I've never seen that before." Bullshit. But the detectives aren't buying it, and they actually tell Howard before leaving, "We have the baby, Howard. We're going to get a DNA warrant. We're going to prove that baby is yours, and then we're going to arrest you for murder." And that's exactly what they left to do, to go get a warrant. But the next morning, September 10th, Howard the Coward Elkins goes to a local Walmart, and it is there that he buys a 12-gauge shotgun and a box of shells. He then goes to a neighbor's home, climbs into the back of their SUV in their garage, and takes his own life. While Howard Elkins' suicide may have been his final confession, post-mortem DNA did confirm with 99.93% certainty that he was the father of the poor child in the barrel. What investigators believe happened in January of 1969 is that Elkins lured Reyna to the factory. It was there that he murdered her in a fit of rage and used his own industrial supplies to hide her. He likely intended to dump that barrel in the ocean, as he did own a boat, but he underestimated the weight. You see, 350 pounds is impossible for one man to lift into a car, let alone over the side of a boat. So instead, he decided to hide it in his own home, under the floorboards, and lived on top of his victim for 3 years before moving to Florida. And you may think that's where the story ends, but actually, it ends in El Salvador. A journalist named Oscar Coral traveled to a small village to find Reyna's mother. And when he found her, he found that she was 95 years old, and for 30 years, she had kept a candle burning for her daughter. She told the reporter she had this reoccurring dream, a nightmare, if you will, of Reyna trapped inside a dark box, calling out for help. Reyna and her son were finally flown home and buried within the soil she was born in. Her mother died just 1 month later, as she had finally found the truth, and now she could finally rest. The lady in the barrel was a secret that was meant to rust away forever. But the truth always has a way of surfacing, even if it takes 30 years and a moving day to do it. Well, my darlings, that wraps up the end of this case, and I just want to thank you for taking the time to listen today and to hear Reyna's story. And as always, I'm here to remind you, my sweet darlings, that while death may be inevitable, it sure as hell doesn't have to be tonight. Until next time.